From the shoreline, somewhere in the distance, he heard a blood-curdling scream, like a woman screaming at the top of her lungs. Jackson had always been a carefree spirit. He did things on his terms, and in most situations, things worked out in his favor. Still a young man of 25, he was not accustomed to heeding warnings and taking advice. He was in pretty good standing with himself, so he valued his own opinions and interpretations of things more favorably than anyone else. But if there was one thing he enjoyed more than doing things his way, it was fishing. Since Jackson graduated college, he didn't get to see his old man too much, but he fondly remembered fishing together, recalling those as some of his best childhood memories. These days, though, his dad was a bit too old for a full day and night of fishing, and none of Jackson's friends were particularly fond of the activity either. That wasn't going to stop him, however. He had his mind set on a fishing trip, and he was going to take it. But, in typical Jackson fashion, he was not going to do any regular fishing trip. He was going to hit a body of water that he had never been to before, and possibly few others have. The topic festered in his mind and became a bit of an obsession. He spent long hours into the night scouring the internet for out-of-the-way, hidden, largely obscure locations, but he finally stumbled upon a small body of water about 4 hours' drive from his apartment. The location was named the Invisible Lake, and he loved the name. Trying to dig into the origin of its namesake, but all he could find was that the small lake was located in a valley surrounded by tall, rocky mountains. Jackson adored the cleverness of the name. That was enough to sell him on the lake, and he shut his laptop, satisfied with his choice. But the rash decision left him ignorant of the disclaimers and the warnings that followed. 2 weeks later, Jackson was packed up, ready to go, Canoe firmly strapped down in his pickup bed, and headed out early on a Saturday, stopping for breakfast at a local joint, eating his fill, and then at the bait store to pick up some last-minute tackle. Satisfied he had everything he needed, he climbed into his truck and headed down the highway towards his destination. His excitement made his trip seem eternal, as he was anxious to get there and start fishing. He was headed out alone, and he wanted it that way. Anyone going with him would be impatient and would probably want to leave when it got dark, probably worried about bugs, noises, and utter darkness. Jackson didn't want to put up with any of that. This was his trip, and much like everything else in his life, he was going to do it his way. After stopping by a store and picking up snacks, food, and supplies a few miles from the mountain roads, Jackson stuffed his cooler, placing it in the passenger seat. It was time to head to the lake. The roads were windy and had certain turns a bit too sharp for being up on hills. Jackson took it easy, letting his adventurous spirit and bravado drive him onward. He entered a seriously questionable tunnel through one of the mountains and came out on the other side a couple minutes later to a lack of paved roads. The path was graveled for about a mile, but then just became a beaten track. He was surprised to see people walking around. They struck him as not the sort of folks one would find in the city or the suburbs. They were not only rural, but mountain-weathered. They looked upon him curiously as he pulled up. Looking around, he began to look for the lake. His GPS was hardly operational in the mountains, and he had no clue where to go from there. Then again, the lake was invisible, he thought, so it certainly lives up to its name. Without any signs around, he was going to have to waste his time wandering around and wanted to get to his fishing expedition. He rolled down the window, flanking an elderly man with a wrinkled face, protruding cheekbones, and deep-set brown-black eyes. "Good afternoon, sir. I'm looking for the lake. The invisible..." Jackson considered how foolish he sounded when completing that sentence, asking for directions to an invisible lake. But he went with it. "Lake. I'm going to do some fishing." The old man stayed silent for a long moment, his eyes shifting to look at Jackson's pickup bed, noting the canoe and buckets. Finally, he turned back to Jackson and said in a grave voice, "Young man, I think you're confused. There is no lake here." He didn't strike Jackson as insincere, but he thought maybe the locals called it something else. He had an odd accent that Jackson couldn't place. "I think you misunderstand. I'm looking for the lake in this valley. Going to do some fishing today." He casually threw his thumb backward over his shoulder and smiled. "Just trying to get down there to set up. It's on the map, but there isn't much of a road here, so I just want the quickest, safest way down." Jackson waited a moment, seeing if the man would speak. When he didn't, Jackson continued, "Look, if you can't help me, that's fine. I'll ask someone else." He gave the man another moment, and then nodded and started rolling up his window, figuring he could take his chances with a less weird local later. Just as the window was almost rolled up, the man spoke, causing Jackson to roll it back down. "It's not a lake, it's a pond, and it's not a good place. You are a young man. Be wise. Find another place." Jackson sighed. "All right. Look, we're both adults here. I don't need the scare tactics. I just want to go fish and—" "No fish," the man interrupted. Jackson was getting fed up, but the man spoke again. "No fish," he said calmly. "There are none in the pond. It's a dead pond. Nothing—" and he hesitated, as if he was trying to use his words carefully, "lives there. You are wasting time and day." Jackson sat back and rolled his eyes. "Listen, man, there are not dead ponds or lakes. There is marine life everywhere that's not a puddle. So I appreciate the local lore, or whatever this is you are getting at, but I am not your responsibility. Just show me the lake or pond, and I'll be gone." The man's black eyes narrowed. "That you'll be. That you'll certainly be. Shane." He pointed down the hill. "Head down a ways and park where the trees get too thick. You'll have to walk from there. You'll know it when you get there, but—" Jackson didn't wait, and he started rolling up his window. "Leave before it gets dark." The stranger's voice was muted by Jackson's shut window and cranked up radio. He gave the stranger a thumbs up and moved forward down the hill. He finally got to a place where the trees were thicker and the beaten path abruptly ended. He looked forward to seeing the lake in front of him. It certainly did look more like a mid-sized pond, and it was obscured by hilly mounds from nearly every side. Jackson got his things together, untied his canoe, and dragged it down. About 20 minutes later, he had everything set, so he pushed the rocking canoe into the water and climbed in, paddling out towards the center. Finally, he was here. Arriving at the center, he set up his fishing gear and cast his line. The sun was way overhead, and his watch told him it was just after 2. The weather was unbelievably pleasant. He thought back fondly on his days with his dad fishing at the lake, making jokes, sometimes inappropriate ones, that had his mother known, she would have lost her mind on both of them, but they had their guy code down pat. Jackson put his headphones in his ears and turned up a playlist of his favorite tunes. This was the life. He could spend every day like this if it wasn't for the pesky need for money from his job. He looked around as he waited for a bite, but saw only the peaceful serenity of the lake and the woods. The music drowned out the sounds of nature, and before he knew it, his rumbling stomach told him it was dinner time. He gladly scuffed down a sandwich, some pickles, and a ginger ale, setting his cooler behind him. He hadn't got a bite, so he positioned the fishing rod under his arm securely and laid his head back on the cooler. The sun was on its way down behind the trees, giving the lake a serene glare and putting on an impressive light and shadow show on the trees. With his music in his ears and the peaceful pond around him, Jackson felt relaxed, and before he knew it, he drifted off to sleep. When he awoke, the music in his ears was still playing, but he had no idea how long he had dozed. He felt the rod under his arm and opened his eyes to take a look around. When he opened them, he first questioned if they were still closed, as all he could see was absolute darkness. He rubbed his eyes, trying to adjust, and blinked away the sleep. It was pitch black as he sat up, rocking the canoe from side to side. He looked around, feeling moisture everywhere, on his face, arms, and legs. He yanked the headphones from his ears. How long had he been asleep? The beats fell away, and Jackson was greeted by a hum of crickets, tree frogs, and night birds. Somewhere off in the distance, he could faintly make out the subtle glare of a crescent moon. This was not ideal. He couldn't see in any direction, so he had no idea where his canoe had floated while he was asleep. Even if he were to start paddling, he would surely end up on the shore, but he had no idea if he would land on the right side, and how would he get to his truck with the canoe? He considered leaving the canoe as long as he could get into the truck, lock the doors, and spend the night in the comfortable seats. He began to question how adventurous his spirit was. It then occurred to him that he had a flashlight in his bag. He felt around for it and found it under one of the canoe seats. He unzipped it and dug into the bag, finally getting his flashlight. He turned it on and pointed it outward. If Jackson was hoping to see the shoreline, he was entirely out of luck. The light reflected in his face immediately, and he had to point it away from his line of sight. He was surrounded by mist. That was the wetness he felt all over. The mist was everywhere. He couldn't see the surface of the water, and he could barely make out his legs in the canoe. The thought of the lake being called invisible suddenly made more sense. He wasn't sure what to do. While he was considering his options, he suddenly felt movement by his leg. His fishing rod was starting to rock backwards and forwards just slightly. Moving his flashlight to the opposite hand, he grasped the rod firmly. There was no tug, but he could feel the canoe moving slightly through the dark, and surrounded by mist, he had no idea about the direction. He focused on his hearing, trying to use his other senses, but all he heard was the noise of nature and the splashing of the water against the side of the canoe. The rod moved a bit more, so he set the flashlight down and grabbed it with both hands. He tried tugging on it slightly, feeling a level of resistance. "No fish? Hey, old-timer," he said out loud to himself, thinking immediately how strange his voice sounded in the darkness. He pulled up on the line more, and the resistance increased. He began to reel slowly to pull whatever was on the other end up. Blind fishing was certainly a brand new experience. The line suddenly jammed, causing Jackson to pull extra hard, tipping back and rocking the canoe unnervingly. What's going on here? He debated on whether or not he should just set the rod down, hold it in place, and wait till he could see once the mist cleared. But there was no guarantee of that happening anytime soon. Looking around, he decided to give the line another pull. As he began to pull, it gave and started moving toward him. Whatever was on the end was close now. He couldn't tell how much was left, but the weight was sizable, and he thought it was close to the surface. Just when something broke the surface of the water, which Jackson could hear but not see, from the shoreline, somewhere in the distance, he heard a blood-curdling scream, like a woman screaming at the top of her lungs. His heart jumped, and he almost let go of the rod, whipping his head around, hopelessly seeing just the mist in the minimal light from the flashlight. Suddenly, the screaming sound was answered again by another, somewhere else off in the distance, and then a third, seemingly from behind him. This one was much closer than the others. Jackson tried to steady the canoe that rocked from his head, whipping backwards and forth. The screams continued. He had to believe it was fisher cats or some other nocturnal animal like a fox. The line became heavier again. He figured he might as well get a catch out of this deal, and he would have a story to tell. He yanked hard as the surface of the lake broke again, and whatever on the end swung towards him, splashing him all over, and covering his face with a wet, slimy, oozy substance. Freaked out, Jackson let go of the rod, dropping it into the canoe and whatever was on the end of it alongside it. He scrambled for the paddle, and as soon as he found it, he began to paddle backward. No matter where in this lake he was, it was better to be on shore. This place was strange, and the surroundings helped nothing. It wasn't long before the canoe hit the shallows. Jackson grabbed the flashlight, desperately looking behind him to see if he could identify the shoreline. Luckily, he was close, so he pushed off with his oar a bit more and stopped short when his entire canoe was on the shallow part of the pond. He stepped out and pulled it up on the shore. The screaming sounds from around the lake began again. Two of them seemed like they were only a dozen feet away. He pulled the canoe up, smacking his head on branches along the way. The mist was slightly less dense here. Jackson swung the flashlight around him and up the hill, hoping he was near his truck. He didn't see it at first, so he looked back into the canoe and stepped back as he saw a dark shape in it. The shape didn't move, so he peeked closer, noting that it was a large water plant. Feeling like a coward, he looked around with the flashlight again, looking up the hill. About 30 feet up, he saw what looked like the front of his truck. He wasn't going to waste any time. Yanking on the canoe to make sure it was fully out of the water, Jackson cautiously but quickly began to scramble up the hill, but he had to turn back because his keys were still in his bag. He grabbed the entire bag and climbed up the hill. The screams didn't stop, and the tree frogs were unbearably loud. He dug for his keys, trying to get them out while keeping the flashlight in front of him. As he made it up the slope, the mist cleared slightly and he could see his truck. He clicked the key button to unlock it, and the headlights flashed brightly, illuminating the misty night. He was close now, and he scrambled to the truck as quickly as he could. When he got there, he threw open the passenger door and got in, realizing something caught his foot. Panicking, he ripped at it, and it came loose, letting him in the truck as he turned and slammed the door and the lock shut behind him. At least here he felt in relative peace. He huddled up in the seats and looked around until exhaustion overtook him. Surprising as it was, since he had just woken up a while ago, he fell asleep. When he woke up in the morning, the sun was shining into his truck, and he squinted as he moved out of the way. He glanced around, seeing nothing but the serene scene from the previous day. As he made his way out of the truck, he realized that a root by the truck had a small piece of his pants on it. That explains his foot from last night. He got down the hill, threw the giant water plant out of his canoe, and dragged it up the hill, tying it to his truck bed. After struggling to turn his truck around, he finally headed back up the hill. When he neared what began to resemble a road, he saw a couple people sitting on a log. One of them was the old man he saw the other night. As he drove by, the man smiled slyly and raised his hand in an almost mocking gesture. Jackson ignored it and drove home, vowing to make this weird lake a truly invisible one to him from now on.